Hello everyone, welcome back to Bonepile Miniatures. This video is a continuation of a discussion about the Bonepile Miniatures mixed rule set. And this is video number 2 of a series. So if you have not watched video number 1, or you do not remember what was covered in it, I recommend that you pause this video and go back and watch the first one. You can find the rules playlist on my channel and look for video number 1, which is about the basic rules. Video number 1 is short and doesn't cover a lot of ideas, but the ones we do cover are essential for understanding some of the ideas in this video. Nothing in there is difficult to understand, but they are an essential foundation. So I recommend checking that out. So to recap, the Bonepile Miniatures mixed rule set is basically our club's version of the 9th edition. It was heavily influenced by the Warhammer Armies Project, but we did not adopt all of their ideas into our rule set. And we also added some of our own ideas. In this video, you are going to get more of a taste of some of our own ideas. The purpose of this video series is intended to inform those who are watching our battle reports, so they can follow our games. And if you would like to ask questions or make comments about our rule set, feel free to do so. But we are not trying to compete with other 9th edition rules. This is just information. If you would like to study these rules further, they are also available on our Warhammer hobby blog at bonepileminiatures.com. Look for them under our Rules Supplements tab. So without further ado, let's get on with this discussion. In this video, we'll focus on the turn phase chapter of the rules, from the movement phase all the way through the combat phase and into the panic rules. In the next video, we will focus on special rules, or what I often call the key words chapter. But here we go with the phase rules. And so of course we will start with the movement phase. And once again, the language in this document is short and concise. And I apologize if each phrase is not completely clear. This guide is meant for those who are already familiar with 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy rules. So to get a better understanding of the rules in this guide, you may need to review the original 8th edition rules. And in this document, words and details are kept to a minimum in order to preserve space. Also, when you look at this document, all the text in black is consistent with 8th edition rules, and the changes that we have made are noted in red text. That way, someone already familiar with the 8th edition should be able to just skim through the rules and only focus on the text in red. And that is the way I will do things on this video. The text in black will just be quickly skimmed through, and then we'll spend more of our time on the changes in red. Okay, so now you are looking at the first page of rules. And starting with the movement phase, you can see that all the text on this page is in black. So there are no changes here. Basic movement is the same, the wheel and the reform are the same, declaring charges is the same, and charge reactions are the same. So let's go to the next page. So on this page, the first change that we find is under the Roll Charge Distances heading. And it says, in black text, roll a 2d6 for each charge to determine the distance. But then in red it says, move M plus the highest value rolled. Now in the 8th edition that would have said, move M plus both dice values rolled. But in this version it's just the highest die value. Now I picked up this idea on changing the charge distances from the Warhammer Armies Project. And I think it's a great idea. I like this rule because I think some of the charge distances seen in the 8th edition tended to get unrealistically long in some cases. And so this rule helps tame that down a bit. So after that, the failed charge distances has the same rule as 8th edition, but then there's another change with charging into fleeing units. It says, the charging unit automatically causes wounds on the fleeing unit based upon its unit strength. Now in the 8th edition, the fleeing unit would automatically get wiped out, no matter the size difference between the two units. And sometimes that also seemed too unrealistic. So I think this is a great rule that helps control that situation. It is now possible for a fleeing unit to survive a charge. They might just barely survive, but at least they have a chance with this rule. But of course, you would need to know the unit strength of both units. You may need to review my first video if you don't remember how to do that. Unit strength is covered in that video, but it's a simple concept and simple math equation to figure it out for each unit. And it's a concept that is not new to the Warhammer Fantasy universe. So let's keep moving on from here. Next is the compulsory moves, and looks like rallying fleeing units is the same, but there is a little change under fleeing units. Typically, under the 8th edition rules, units do not have to take dangerous terrain checks when fleeing through dangerous terrain. They only take checks when they are moving through impassable terrain. And to me, that never really made any sense. When people are panicked, it seems like dangerous terrain would be just as dangerous, if not more so, than under normal conditions. It seems to me that when someone has lost their head or wits, they are more likely to get hurt, not less likely to get hurt. So in our rules, fleeing units take dangerous terrain checks in dangerous terrain. And that dangerous terrain check is covered more fully in the chapter about terrain. And we will cover those changes when we get to that section. Okay, so moving on. It looks like other compulsory moves are the same, and so we move into the remaining moves. Marching and such are all the same. And now look under reinforcements. I have an optional rule here. Emphasis on optional. But I recommend that if one player uses the option, that both players use it in order to be fair and balanced. So under reinforcements it says, option to use the scatter dice to determine the board edge that reinforcements enter. And this is an optional rule that I came up with, and I like it because this game is set in the Dark Ages. They didn't carry around GPS units or have any kind of modern communication or navigation equipment back then. The reinforcements would have only followed the sound of battle cries and the wailing injured. They would not have shown up on the battlefield exactly where you wanted them to, unless maybe you're Gandalf or something. But they likely would have just shown up at a random location somewhere on the battlefield. So there's an option to represent that with the scatter dice, and I like the idea. It adds a little variety and unpredictability to the game, which I think is always fun. Okay, so after reinforcements, I have another change where I made an official provision for surrendering units. And that's because I have watched many games where a player just wants to throw in the towel for a particular unit, or the whole game. So I made an official rule for that. It reads, surrender. Players may choose to surrender to an enemy, lord, or hero within 12 inches of the unit. Now the reason for that is because if you try to surrender to rank and file troops, they will most likely ignore surrenderers and consider no mercy toward the other team. Only with army leaders would you have even a small chance to have your surrender accepted. Then it says, the surrendering unit is frozen on the field. And that's because surrendered units always seem to get in the way of battle. And they certainly aren't safe just because they surrender. They can still be struck by cannon fire or whatever else, or stomped on by giants. It also says that their weapon skill goes to 1, and that's just because they are no longer fighting. The rule also says that they can still be attacked, For example, an army general may not be interested in prisoners, so they can still be killed without mercy. Now, the winning army will not get any more points out of the unit after they initially surrender, but there may be a reason why the general would just prefer to get rid of them instead of taking them captive. If the unit or units were the last ones in the army to surrender, then the game is immediately over, and points are tallied accordingly. Okay, so that's the last change on that page, and this also ends the section on the movement phase. And so next is the magic phase. And as you would expect, I've made a lot of changes to the magic phase. There's a lot of red on the next page, and a lot of 9th editions have made serious changes to the magic phase, and mine is no different. As for myself, I'm actually a big fan of the magic phase and the magic in Warhammer Fantasy in general. So most of my changes with magic are an attempt to merely scale the magic and not eliminate it. I've borrowed a few ideas from the Warhammer Armies Project, but most of it comes from my own ideas. And under our system, magic can still be powerful, but it is a situation where you will get out of it according to what you put into it. Magic can have a small or a large impact on the game, depending on your investment into it. The choice and strategy is up to each player. Okay, so here's the first page for the magic phase. Now keep in mind as I read through this that my intention was not to eliminate magic, but to merely try to scale it according to your level of investment into it. So let's start reading through the changes. So under the Wizard Spells heading, it says, all wizards know the signature spell for their lore, and they know additional spells by their wizard level. And to me it just makes sense that if a spell is the signature spell, that everyone should know it who knows the lore. And then all wizards build off of that one as they learn new spells. So as you add more spells by wizard level, you'll get a level 1 wizard that knows 2 spells, because he'll know the signature spell and 1 more spell. And then a level 3 wizard will know 4 spells, because he'll know the signature spell plus 3 more. And so it's a pretty easy scale to remember, but a little different than what most 8th edition players are used to. Okay, so let's keep reading on. It says, each spell can only be known once in the same army most of the time. Other options must be exhausted before another wizard knows the same spell, except for lore masters. And I think that seems pretty clear. And I know that the Warhammer Armies Project takes the same approach to distributing spells among their wizards. And if nothing else, I think that fosters variety, which I think is always good in this game. And of course, the lore masters should know all the spells in their lore, and they should not influence what spells other wizards know. Okay, so let me continue on with that paragraph. Reading on, it says, wizards know the spell numbers up to their wizard level plus 1. Lore masters are all automatically wizard level 5, and are the only ones who may know spell number 6. And during game setup, re-roll for ineligible spells. And ineligible spells basically refers to if you roll a spell number that your wizard can't know by this rule, or also spells that have already been taken by another wizard. So even though I think this is a new idea, I think it's still pretty simple to understand. Each lore should have 6 spells, and each spell number gets progressively more powerful. And to me it makes sense that low-level wizards would not know the more powerful spells, but boss wizards would know most spells, if not all, from their lore. So wizards may know spells 1 value higher than their wizard level. For example, a level 2 wizard will know the signature spell, plus they will know 2 more spells from spell 1 to 3. and they will be determined randomly. A level 4 wizard will know the signature spell plus 4 more spells from spell 1 through 5. And then a lore master, which is wizard level 5, which is something new, but I think it makes a lot of sense. A lore master would be wizard level 5, and then would know the signature spell plus 5 more spells from number 1 through 6. Now you could play that lore masters know all spells from their lore, and I have no problem with anyone playing that way. And that's pretty much what the lore master special rule says. So that's how most people would probably play that. But if you and your opponent decided to play that lore masters only know 5 spells in addition to the signature spell, then I'm fine with that too. It's only a difference of 1 spell. So I don't mind it being played either way. It doesn't matter to me, as long as both armies are consistent. But I think most people will most likely play that lore masters know all spells from their lore. And if you think about it, with the way I have this set up, if your wizard is supposed to know more than 1 spell, it might be easier to roll for the 1 spell that he doesn't know among the range of possible spells he could know, instead of repeatedly rolling for the spells that he does know. For example, if I have a wizard level 2, he could know 2 spells from spell 1 through 3. Instead of rolling for those 2 spells that he does know, I could just roll for the 1 spell that he doesn't know. And that would apply to any level of wizard. And it might be the easier and quicker approach to figuring out which spells he knows. Okay, so I think that wraps up the first paragraph that covers how many spells each wizard knows and which spell numbers they can know. And now let's move on. So the magic turn moves along in the same order as always, but I've got a change here with the winds of magic. Remember now that I intended to scale everything. So this reads, for the winds of magic, roll 1d6 per highest wizard level in the army. Example, a wizard level 3 allows 3d6 for the winds of magic roll. So that means that the winds of magic will be small if you only brought along a low-level wizard. And the winds of magic could be very big if you bring a high-level wizard. So this is a simple mechanism that controls the amount of magic in the game. And like I said before, it is tied to the wizard level that you bring to the battle. So if you and your opponent only bring level 1 wizards, then magic will be a very light component to the game, which makes a lot of sense. And if you both bring level 4 wizards, or lore masters even, then magic will be a big influence on the game. You get to decide. Your investment into magic controls how much of an influence it will be. So you and your opponent could agree at the beginning of a game to a points level for the game to determine the size of army, and you could also even agree to the highest wizard level in the game, and that would control how much magic would be in the game. Or you don't have to, you could leave it open-ended. But the whole point is that the size of the winds of magic is controlled by the highest wizard level that you bring to the game. So once again, if you only bring a level 1 wizard, then you're only going to roll 1d6 for your winds of magic roll. If you bring a level 2 wizard, then you're only going to roll 2 dice for the winds of magic. And so forth all the way up to the highest wizard levels. And so the winds of magic roll is going to determine the power pool that is available to your team's wizards. There's nothing new there. Okay, so now let's move on to the dispel pool, which is going to be quite a bit different than what you are used to. And it is once again determined by your investment into magic. It's scaled just like the rest of this system. So under the dispel pool heading, it says, treat the above roll, or the winds of magic roll, as a D3 dice roll instead of D6. And what that means is, on average, the dispel pool will be about half the size of the power pool, which means that magic on the offense is going to have the advantage over magic on the defense. But that's how it was in the 8th edition anyways. Now let's continue. It says, next, if there is no wizard on your team, but you have magical resistance, then treat the Winds of Magic roll as a D2 instead of a D6. So the D2 means is that on average you will have a dispel pool about 1/3 the size of the power pool, because a D2 basically treats 1 through 3 rolls as a 1 and then 4 through 6 rolls as a 2. So anyways, an army that has no wizard but has magical resistance is going to have a reduced sized dispel pool. And to me that just makes a lot of sense, because it seems like you would need a wizard to fight another wizard. So an army that does not have a wizard will be at a disadvantage against a team that does. But of course, having some magic resistance is better than nothing. And that's why I have the dispel pool set up the way it is in that situation. But the text also says that you can have bonus dispel dice come from other sources as well. So for example, if you have a terrain feature or a dispel scroll or something, then those would apply on top of what you're allowed with these rules. And that would also apply to the following statement, which finishes up this dispel pool section by saying, if you don't have a wizard and you don't have magic resistance, then you don't have a dispel pool. And once again, I think that just makes a lot of sense. But of course, you could still have a dispel scroll or something like that, but you wouldn't have a dispel pool if you did not bring a wizard and you don't have magic resistance. And I've always thought it was strange in the 8th edition for armies without wizards to have the ability to dispel spells. But in this rule set, deciding to go without a wizard would have some consequences in being able to dispel. And you could still do that, but that is a strategic decision each army will have to make. Now, in most large games, this will probably not be a big issue, as most armies would be able to afford to take a wizard. But in games of low and medium points values, there's more of a weighty decision to make. Each army will have to ask, should I invest in a wizard? Will my opponent bring one? If my enemy does have a wizard, will it be of a low value or a high value? Can I bear through the consequences without a wizard, or should I make sure I have one? And that's all part of the strategy of the game with this rule set. And I know I've certainly played some games with these rules where I decided not to take a wizard and compensate my army with other strategic advantages. And I like how this puts a little more weight into the strategy of army configuration. I like how this rule set takes the magic phase out of autopilot and forces you to decide what to do with it. It forces you to make an investment if you want to use that strategy in your army. And it makes you weigh the consequences of what you might bring in the face of what your opponent might bring. So one technical question that people might ask is, what if my army does not have magic resistance, and I give one of my characters a magic item that gives him some magic resistance? Does that count as a magic resistance for the whole army in terms of having a dispel pool? In answer to that question, I would say yes. But that also makes it so that if your character is killed and your army loses that magic item, then your army would no longer have a dispel pool unless it had magic resistance from another source. So that might be an easy way to give your army some magic resistance if you choose not to take a wizard. You can take an amulet or something else that gives you something that you can work with. And I hope this section doesn't seem too complicated. Armies without wizards, like dwarves and some demons, might not like this rule, but there's certainly ways to compensate for it. You can still bring dispel scrolls and things like that, but being able to dispel spells will not be a forte of those armies. you might be able to compensate by digging a little deeper into your list of runes and demonic gifts and things like that. And we have certainly tested these rules out many times. And I have successfully played armies where I did not bring a wizard and just brought some kind of a amulet that gave me magic resistance, and I didn't think I was at too much of a disadvantage during the magic phase. But I had planned and compensated for other advantages in other parts of the game. And every army has strengths and weaknesses that we have to work with. And to me, that's one of the biggest appeals to this whole game, is learning how to fine-tune your army and meet the challenges that face you. And I, for one, don't like to play this game on autopilot. I like to devise a strategy that I can use to take down each of my opponents, even though I may not have everything I ever wanted for my army. Okay, so let's move on. Next is channeling, and I do have another change for that. It says, before a wizard casts a spell, roll a d6. If the d6 plus the wizard's level is 7+, then gain a free die not from the power pool. So this means that wizards can try to channel for each spell they try to cast. And the wizard who does the channeling gets the benefit of the channel. It does not pass on to others, except that there may be less dependence upon the power pool for that one spell. So simply roll a channel die before each spell. If you get a 7+ with your d6 and wizard level, then you get a free die. So the effect of this rule is that it will be harder for low-level wizards to channel, but more powerful wizards should have less trouble with it. For example, a level 1 wizard will need to roll a 6 in order to channel. A level 3 wizard will need to roll a 4+ in order to channel. And a lore master, which in our system is a level 5, will only need to channel on a 2+ to reach that 7+ threshold. It may not seem fair, but I think it seems reasonable for it to be that way. It should be more difficult for low-level wizards to channel, and a lot easier for the powerful wizards to do it. So after all that, building the power pool and the dispel pool and trying to channel, it's finally time to try to cast a spell. So under choose number of power dice, it says, choose up to the wizard level plus 2 dice. Add channeled dice if applicable. Maximum of 7 dice from all sources. And that's of course one higher than the maximum in the 8th edition of 6 dice. But this is another way to scale the magic in this rule set. And I think I got this idea from the Warhammer Armies Project, to have the wizard level plus 2 dice that can be used to cast each spell. So a level 1 wizard can only roll 3 dice to cast a spell. And a level 3 wizard could roll up to 5. A level 4 could roll 6. And then of course a lore master, who is a level 5 in our system, could roll up to 7, because he is a wizard level 5. Now adding a channeled dice is the only way a wizard can exceed their normal maximum. So if a level 1 wizard channeled, she could roll a 4th dice for free. A level 3 wizard that channeled could roll 3 plus 2 plus the 1 more that was channeled. So that would be a maximum of 6 for her. A lore master could roll up to 7 dice, since he is a level 5. But a lore master does not get an 8th dice if she channeled, since 7 is the maximum from all sources. Now if the lore master did channel, she can still use the channeled die and reduce the number of dice needed from the power pool to get the maximum of 7. But as you can imagine, maximizing the dice can also get extremely dangerous, so it is not an action without major risks involved. A wizard can always roll less dice than their allowable maximum. And I think this is a really good rule. It makes a lot of sense and it helps scale the magic once again. Because a low-level wizard will only be able to roll a few dice at a time. So it meshes well with the idea that low-level wizards can only know the low-numbered spells, which have lower casting values. So I think this whole magic system that we've devised at Bonepile Miniatures all works well together and creates a truly scaled magic system. Okay, so let's move on to bound spells. They can use 3 dice maximum, and they get 1 free die not from the power pool. And that idea also came from the Warhammer Armies Project. And I think that one's pretty straightforward. So looking under cast results, everything here is the same. Under 3 is an automatic fail, and then failed casts break concentration for that wizard. And you also add the wizard's level to the casting value. Double sixes are cast with irresistible force, and see the miscast table. And this is where the Warhammer Armies Project does something completely different, which I don't like. I like the old 8th edition rule where you must consult the miscast chart for some kind of a negative consequence. Any natural double sixes take you there. Now let's move on to dispelling. So let's start off and be clear that if a spell was cast with irresistible force, you cannot try to dispel it. And then for dispelling in general, you must equal or exceed the casting value. But don't forget the wizard level of the wizard you are dispelling with. So what you do is you choose a wizard to dispel with, which is why we came up with the rule that if you do not have a wizard, you do not have a dispel pool. So select dispel dice up to the wizard level plus 2, and that's the same as the casting wizard. But if you only have magic resistance, you get only the 2 dice, because the wizard level does not apply. Then you add any other bonus dispel dice from whatever source to a maximum of 6 from all sources. Now if you recall, the casters have a maximum of 7 dice, but here it says dispellers have a maximum of 6. So the casters have a slight advantage for being on the offense. So you roll the dice and add the dispel wizard's level. Then add whatever magic resistance you might have in your army to the dispel value. So if I had magic resistance 3, then you would add 3 to that dispel value. Of course, double sixes are automatic dispels, unless it was cast with irresistible force, and this whole step would not even apply. And then if you successfully dispel a spell, we've added that you can add D3 dice back into the dispel pool. And if the wizard failed to dispel, he cannot try another dispel, which is the same as if the caster failed to cast a spell, he would break concentration. And the nice thing about adding D3 dice back into the dispel pool is that it helps even the odds against the power pool, which starts with more dice. So there is one more change to magic on the next page, but most of the changes are right here on this page. And I hope this is not too hard to take in. As I said repeatedly throughout this, the aim was not to eliminate magic, but rather to scale it. And the phase can be powerful or weak, depending upon how much you invest into your wizards and such. Magic items can help where you lack in wizard skill. But overall it comes down to your own strategic choice on how to play your army and how to match up with your opponent. But wizard level affects the whole phase, beginning with which spells the wizard may know and how many. It also affects your winds of magic, your power pool and dispel pool, also channeling, and also the number of casting dice. And finally also the maximum number of dispel dice. And now we have finally made it on to the next page. And this page finishes up the magic phase. And the only change here left to cover is that I did go ahead and write my own miscast table. Why did I write my own table? Because I like variety, and I wanted to have a different miscast result for each dice score. So the instruction says, roll a d6 for the miscast table and add the number of power dice used to cast the spell. So if your wizard rolled 4 dice to cast the spell, then you would add 4 to the d6 value. And the higher we go on the table score, the more devastating the consequences will be. And this keeps in harmony with the miscast results from the 8th edition. And so this is why using the maximum number of dice available to a wizard brings some risk to casting spells. And this chart also compensates somewhat for the limitations that low-level wizards have in our system, where they know weaker spells and have smaller chances for channeling and such. At least their consequences on the miscast chart won't be as devastating as the more powerful wizards can be. So now let's read through the list of consequences. So 1 through 3, the wizard cannot cast for the rest of the phase. Okay, so that's pretty basic and the least consequential. And then 4, you lose d3 dice from the power pool, and the wizard cannot cast for the rest of the phase. Okay, for number 5, power drained the wizard by 1 level. He forgets the spell that he cast and cannot cast for the rest of the phase. For number 6, the wizard takes a strength 4 hit. He cannot cast for the rest of the phase and loses d3 plus 1 dice from the power pool. Number 7, the wizard takes a strength 6 hit, cannot cast for the rest of the phase, and loses d6 dice from the power pool. Number 8, wizard and all models in base contact with him take a strength 6 hit and lose d6 dice from the power pool. Now it's starting to get pretty bad. For number 9, wizard and all models under the small template suffer a strength 7 hit, lose d6 dice from the power pool. Number 10, all wizards take a strength 4 hit and the power pool is emptied. 11, the wizard and models under the large template take a strength 10 hit. The power pool is emptied. And then finally number 12, the wizard is automatically removed from the game and all wizards take a strength 6 hit. The power pool is emptied. So you can see that the table gets progressively worse with the higher numbers, and that's why using more dice to cast a spell brings extra danger and is not always advised. But on the flip side, low-level wizards are not able to cast with very many dice to begin with, so it is less likely that they will score very high results on the miscast chart. But the higher level wizards are more likely to reach those higher and more dangerous miscast results, and that's because they can roll more dice. And so I think that makes a fun little twist to the magic phase that adds to the trouble with it. So I think I could almost end the video right here and take a break. Magic is a big topic and I covered many changes. But let's just take a deep breath and keep moving along with the shooting phase. So under the shooting phase, the first change that pops up is under the heading of shooting into combat. And this is another idea that I picked up from the Warhammer Armies Project, but I modified it. It reads, "This, or shooting into combat, may be performed if the line of sight is at an unengaged flank of the enemy. Forces of order must pass a leadership test. and the target must be within 1/2 of the shooter's range. The enemy unit must have a unit strength of at least 5, and this cannot be done with war machines or templates. Resolve hits on friendly models for every roll of 1 for ballistic skills 4+, and for ballistic skills 1 through 3, resolve hits on friendly models for every roll of 1 or 2. Now the Warhammer Armies Project version says that this can only be done if the shooters are within 4 inches of the unit. But I thought that that makes the rule almost pointless, since if I'm already within 4 inches, I'm most likely going to just charge. So we decided to extend the range for this rule out to 1/2 of the shooter's range. But then I added an accuracy variable depending upon the ballistic skill of the shooters, and I think that adds to the risk-benefit analysis that each army would have to make in those situations. A unit with poor marksmanship skills is more likely to hit a friendly model. And so I think the ballistic skill variable adds a fine touch to this rule. Now let's move on to the next page on shooting. Okay, so now on this next page of shooting, looking under the roll to hit, there is a line under the first chart that defines how to roll a 7+ or an 8+ or a 9+ on a D6 roll. And those applications will come up very shortly. And then I added a couple more shooting modifiers. First of all, I have a -1 for volley fire. And I've added that because most volley fire isn't really even done with aiming. And then those volley arrows are shooting high into the sky and will be very susceptible to wind effects. So I decided to put a -1 to hit with volley fire. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I added a -1 to hit for lone models of unit strength 1 or 2. And that matches up with the skirmishers, who are harder to hit because they are not bunched up in a group. And then for a whole nother earth-shattering change, I wrote a new wound chart. But I'm going to skip this chart for now because it is the same chart that shows up in the combat phase. See in the upper left corner, this same chart works for both weapon skill and strength and toughness comparisons. So I'm going to skip this chart for now and talk about it in a minute when I get to the combat phase. The next page doesn't have any red with rolls to save and such. So let's go to the next page after that. So as you can see, that ends the shooting phase. And there clearly weren't as many changes on the shooting phase as there were with the magic phase. And so now we're going to move on to the combat phase. So on the first page of the combat phase, there's really just a little clarification note for 7+ rolls. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory when you read it. And then here we come again to the wound chart on the next page. And it's clear that I rewrote the whole thing. Let's have a look at what I did. So look at the upper right corner area of the chart. Notice that I have a bunch of 9+, 8+, and 7+ values in there. And that's why I had to define those dice rolls on the previous page, because you need to know how to get them in order to work this chart. And so in effect, numbers like 7+ and such make it harder to score. And notice what area of the chart that these harder numbers are located in. It's the area where bigger beasts and monsters are typically found with high toughness. And so in effect, this chart will make it a little harder to score hits and wounds against monsters and other elite warriors. And I got the idea for this kind of chart
from the Lord of the Rings battle game made by Games Workshop. Their charts have these kinds of higher numbers in the high toughness area. And so one of the common complaints I hear about 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy all the time is that monsters tend to die too quickly. And I always thought that it was the fault of the wound chart. And so I have adopted this Lord of the Rings style chart to help mitigate that problem of quickly dying monsters. And I haven't seen any other 9th edition system try to tackle this problem. But also look back at the chart and notice that the die results step up and down by 2s instead of by 1s. And that's the second change that I made to the chart. And I mainly did that so that I could accommodate those 8s and 9s on the right side of the chart. But what that also effectively does is it makes it slightly harder to slay almost everything. Even matches are still 4s, but everything else steps up and down by 2s. So in effect, not only will monsters survive a little longer than before in the 8th edition, but all units will survive a little longer than most 8th edition players are used to. And that's because the 8th edition chart steps up and down by 1s across the spectrum until it hits the 2s and 6s. And I do think this result is worth it, if this chart helps keep monsters around a little longer. And I think this is a simple solution to implement, and the chart is very easy to memorize. You just have to remember that you must step up and down by 2 instead of by 1 like in the 8th edition. And so I think that's a pretty substantial change that I've made to the wound chart. And once again it applies to weapon skill comparisons and also strength and toughness comparisons for both the shooting and the combat phase. Okay, so let's move on from that. And it looks like there's no more changes for that page. The armor saves, ward saves, and parries are all the same. So let's move on to the next page. And here we see the topic of combat resolution. And there are a couple of changes in here. So first of all, the Battle Standard Bearer now gives a +2 bonus for combat resolution instead of just 1. Now the normal standards still give a +1 to combat resolution, but now the BSB gives a little bit more bonus than the standard banners. Okay, and then I have another change that says a +1 bonus for aerial attacks. And that is another rule that can be ignored if you are not using my flying rules supplement. And that means I have produced a rule supplement for our club's flying rules. And I am planning on releasing a video explaining our flying rules in conjunction with this main rule set. So if you are watching this video, you can also look for my video about our flying rules in order to see what we are up to with those. But if you are not using our flying rules supplement, you can ignore this change to the combat resolution. And so after combat resolution and before taking the break test, we have another new set of rules which we call the cumulative leadership, which is basically a system that gives rewards and penalties in terms of leadership values to the winners and losers of combat resolution, respectively. So let's read what it says. It says, the loser of a combat takes a -1 penalty to the unit's leadership value. The winner will take a +1 bonus to the unit's leadership value. Penalties and bonuses accrue with each combat phase to a maximum of ±3 of the original leadership. Cumulative leadership has a maximum value of 11 and a minimum value of 3, and this is considered the cumulative leadership value, and it persists throughout the game. And so we came up with this rule to represent the ebb and flow of unit morale throughout combat. As units are victorious in battle, they gain more confidence and their courage grows. But also the opposite happens. As units consistently lose fights, they will be less courageous and more likely to break away from battle. And so this cumulative leadership concept is then used in place for all leadership tests for the rest of the game that involve the leadership check. And it is especially used for break tests and panic tests. And we have worked on this rule for a long time and played with different limits to penalties and bonuses. We started with no maximum or minimum values. We've also done plus or minus 5 leadership. And we ultimately settled with plus or minus 3. And that's because 3 allows a unit a better chance to rally back from being behind with leadership penalties. It is also easier to lose momentum with a maximum of 3 as well. We found that with limits of plus or minus 5, it was sometimes impossible for a new winning streak to overcome a less recent losing streak. And it seems like the most recent trend should carry more weight than an old trend when it comes to unit morale. And so we found that plus or minus 3 is a good value, and we are very happy with it, and it seems to work. And this rule really adds a new dimension to the game, and it brings extra rewards and consequences for battlefield success and failure. And you will see this rule used a lot during our battle reports. So the next section to talk about is the break test. And of course there's a note here to make sure that you use the cumulative leadership to make break tests with. And now we are using the same steadfast rules as the 8th edition. And we have toyed with alternative steadfast rules, but ultimately we settled with using the original 8th edition version of it. So combat reforms also use the same cumulative leadership value. And then there's some more changes under flee and pursue. And once again, this has to do with the unit strength rule, which we have already talked about. But the text says, if pursuing units catch fleeing units, then the pursuers cause 1 wound for every point of unit strength in their unit. So once again, it is possible that a fleeing unit will not get completely wiped out if charged by another unit. They only take damage according to the unit strength of the unit that caught them. Then after that, there's some more details about fleeing through dangerous terrain. And as I've already mentioned during the movement phase, that we do force dangerous terrain checks for fleers. And our rules say that they fail dangerous terrain on a 1 or a 2. Normally fleers don't take dangerous terrain checks at all in the 8th edition, but we think it is more likely for units who are panicked to get injured in dangerous terrain than units that are not fleeing. And they also fail a dangerous terrain check in impassable terrain on a 1 to 3. And no saves allowed in impassable terrain. Now this also applies to pursuers, but pursuers will stop 1 inch away from entering into impassable terrain. But they will follow fleers into dangerous terrain and are subject to the same amount of danger. They also fail on a 1 or a 2. Okay, so let's move on to the next page, and this is the last page on this chapter of the turn phases. So under the panic rules, there is a note to remind you to take your panic test on your cumulative leadership as already mentioned. And then after that, we take a panic test for all the same reasons as in 8th edition. There's no changes there. And then after the panic test, we've added one more rule that we've come up with, which we call the killed leader reaction chart. And let me read what it says. Immediately roll a d6 on the killed leader reaction chart whenever the following occurs. Number 1, your army general is killed. Or number 2, another lord or hero is killed within 12 inches. And it says roll separately for each surviving lord and hero first, and those results pass on to the unit if it is within one. Then roll separately for each remaining unit without a lord or hero in it. So basically there's 2 conditions. If your army general is killed, every unit must make this roll. But if another hero or lord that's not the general is killed, then it only applies to those units that are within 12 inches of that character. So the reaction chart works off just a 1d6, and here's what it says. And take note that each unit is going to roll on this chart separately, so each one may have a different reaction. So for number 1, that unit takes an immediate panic test, which means they're going to want to flee away from battle after seeing their leader killed. And then for result number 2, take a leadership test, and if failed, gain fear of the unit that killed the leader. And so in this case, the unit's going to fear whoever killed that character. And a question that is going to probably come up is, what if the unit already causes fear? Is it going to cascade into terror in that case? The way that we've been playing that is not automatic. So we roll a D2. On a 4+, it's a yes. Otherwise, it's a no. So the fear doesn't always cascade into terror. Just depends on the roll of the dice. And now moving on to result number 3. Immediately lose 1 leadership. And then number 4. If a wizard was killed, skip your next magic phase. And this is the only one that's conditional. So if a wizard was not killed, you would just ignore this result. There's no need to re-roll it. And number 4 is also the only result that applies to the whole army. So even if just one unit rolls this number 4, then it applies to the whole army. You will have to skip your next magic phase, because somehow the winds of magic won't flow due to the death of that wizard. Okay, now on to number 5. The unit gains hatred for that unit that killed the leader. So sometimes the death of a favored leader can lead to the rally of an army. And in this case, the unit would gain hatred for the unit that killed the leader. And finally, result number 6. Gain frenzy. The unit would gain frenzy in general application, and it would not be directed only towards the unit that killed the leader. And of course, if the unit already has frenzy, then this does not add any extra effects. It's still just normal frenzy. Alright, so now that's the end of this chart. So the reason for this reaction chart is to better reflect the effect that leaders have on their armies. And the death of a leader can have major consequences throughout the army. However, some consequences can be bad and others could be good. And each unit may respond differently. So that's the purpose of this chart, is to reflect those possible reactions. So now that finishes this page on the panic rules. And this is also the end of all the turn phase rules. Thank you for sticking with me to the end of this video. And this video definitely covered a few major changes and several minor changes. So let me quickly summarize. In the movement phase, we changed the charge distances and the damage that's caused by units that charge into fleeing units. And then there's also dangerous terrain checks for fleeing units and rules for surrendering units. The magic phase saw many changes. The entire magic system is based off of wizard level, from the number of spells that a wizard may know to which spells each wizard may know, based upon their skill level. We also changed the winds of magic, the dispel pool, channeling, and the number of dice that each wizard may roll to cast a spell. Also the number of dice that a wizard may cast to dispel a spell. And we also wrote our own miscast chart. And for the shooting phase, we added a new rule for shooting into combat. We also have a couple new shooting modifiers and a new roll to wound chart. And then after that, there's a couple new modifiers for calculating close combat results. We also have a new system for calculating what we call the cumulative leadership value. And then fleers and pursuers must take dangerous terrain checks when they pass through dangerous terrain. And then finally we have in the panic phase what we call the killed leader reaction chart. And once again, I think that's a lot of changes. And so if you would like to study these changes a little more, you can go to my hobby blog, which is bonepileminiatures.com. Once you're there, you can find a tab for rule supplements, and you can find these rules under that heading. And so with that, I am going to conclude this video. The next video in this series will be focused on the special rules, or what I often call the key words. So words like frenzy and hatred will be defined there. And it should be a much shorter video than this one, as the changes in that chapter will not be quite as substantial as the changes that were in this chapter. And so I hope to catch you with the next video, and until then, and as always, happy wargaming.